So good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. My name is Cheryl Hamilton. I am the director of Suitcase Stories at the International Institute of New England. Suitcase Stories is one of our signature programs where we raise the profile of refugee and immigrant voices and explore how storytelling can be used to create more welcoming and inclusive communities. The International Institute is a nonprofit organization. We are based in Greater Boston, Lowell, Massachusetts, and Southern New Hampshire and Manchester. And we provide services to about 2,500 immigrants and refugees annually, usually in person and right now remotely. We provide refugee resettlement support, case management, ESL classes, employment support, skills training, and legal services, which are more important than ever. And today is our continuation of our Suitcase Stories conversations. This is where we invite people who previously performed in our Suitcase Stories series to come back and tell us more about their backstories, but also just more about their lives and what they are doing out there to support refugees and immigrants. And I am especially excited today by our guest, Anita Fabos. She is the professor of international development, community, and environment at Clark University, where I graduated from many years ago. Anita and I also have collaborated since then on projects exploring how we bring together US and foreign-born residents. I got the privilege to co-teach with her. She invited me to do that. And then she was very kind to agree to tell a story back in 2018 at our World Refugee Day Suitcase performance at the City Winery. So we have lots to talk about. Thanks, Anita, and welcome.
Thanks, Cheryl. Such a treat to be here and to be involved in your project. It's really awesome.
Oh, well, we're the ones that are lucky. So, Anita, you have a long resume in this field and a long association with forced migration. Can you tell people how you got into this field and a little bit more about your career?
Sure. Career-wise, I fell into forced migration studies a little bit by accident. I was really in the old days, I was an anthropologist, and my work was with people from refugee backgrounds living in Cairo, mostly from the Horn of Africa and specifically from the northern parts of Sudan. Mm-hmm. And little by little, I found that I found my way into the field of forced migration and refugee studies, which is a fairly new field. It's interdisciplinary, and it got its start really at Oxford University in the UK. But I know you in our prompts, you asked me to say a little bit about maybe my own personal background in the world of forced migration. And that really is through my father, who was a refugee from Hungary, who came to the United States with a lot of other Hungarian refugees in 1956. He arrived in New York City on New Year's Eve, and he still remembers that. He's still alive, and he talks about it a lot. So I grew up with those stories, and I grew up also with some tension in the household because my father sent a lot of money back to his relatives in Hungary. So I always thought that was something that I recognized that maybe some of my other friends didn't really have going on in their houses.
It's interesting you mentioned New Year's Eve. We just had a storyteller from Syria share how she arrived in the United States on Christmas morning, and she considers it's the most memorable Christmas she and her children will have ever had. So it's those markers that are so important. So that eventually, interested in education, started looking at forced migration. It's interesting you just said, which is a relatively new field when we think about the history of refugee migrations over time. Why do you think that was? What broke out to make it its own unique discipline?
Well, I think that's such a good question. I think partly refugees had been rolled into maybe migration studies, which has a long history, much longer history. But I think the 1980s was also the rise of humanitarian efforts. So there were a lot more humanitarian agencies doing a lot more work with encamped refugees specifically in Africa, but all around the world. And people started looking into the past for lessons of what had worked or not worked well.
In addition to all the work you do this project that focuses on ethical storytelling and ethical interviewing with a project called Witness, which we often at Suitcase Stories get asked about, like, how do you approach someone and invite them to share their story, or what are the pitfalls or challenges with that? So could you describe the project and some of the lessons and work you've done there?
You bet. This project has been with my colleague Leora Khan. And Leora is a storytelling professional who works on peace building and conflict resolution work, and moved into the world of refugees, joining me with some thinking about how we could help interviewers listen more carefully and listen differently to the stories that refugees and other forced migrants were telling us. And some of our thinking was that a lot of us are not familiar with what people really go through in their movements across space and time. And we thought that if we helped people sit in that space and learn how to understand what it felt like to be in a situation where things were uncertain, where you were moving, where you didn't know what was going on. So we did some training with people to recognize our assumptions and biases as people without refugee backgrounds who come maybe from a settled background. And we did these partnerings where people role played the stories, or having to own a story of somebody from a forced migration background and really understand what it feels like from that visceral perspective. And I think it really helped the people in our trainings to listen to stories differently, to listen to the stories of our colleagues and friends who have been through an experience of forcible displacement. To sort of look for moments and not be so quick with our own assumptions about what a refugee looks like or what a forced migration experience is like.
Right. What are some of the lessons people have said when they've participated in these trainings and taken away?
That's a great question. I think one theme that was coming out for us was the feeling that there wasn't necessarily only one significant place of home for people who had been on the move. So I think often we in the settled communities, we think, oh, well, there's home and then there's here. And people either, if they can't go home, they are now here. And I think what we were starting to hear from people is, oh, I didn't realize how much people move on a transit journey, let's say, and how those places are still significant in their lives. So, for example, a lot of my participants in the research that I did in Cairo, even though they've left Cairo behind, they were refugees there maybe for 5 years, and they moved somewhere else, or they got something that was a bit more permanent. They have family there still, they have friends there, it's significant in their world, it's part of their narrative. And I know that makes sense, when we think about it, but I know that somehow in the world of resettlement, which we've talked about a lot, sometimes it does seem that those stories are not as important. For those of us who are listening, they want to know the story of displacement and uprooting, and they're not as interested in this longer, all the different chapters that make up a person's moving story.
No, yeah, we definitely talked about this, and I think even this is one of the reasons that Suitcase Stories evolved, is we were looking for nuanced stories, right? The mainstream media, if you want to not blame somebody, but what's often shared is this very before and after, right? And this very much need of like building the new life. And surely there is newness to it, but that predisposes to like this idea that if they're going to be here in this country, they're going to be American and they're going to live this American life. But my experience, like yours, is that most of the people I know who are immigrants have this legs in more than one place, many places in some ways. We were just talking about how I began in my career in Lewiston, Maine, working with about 5,000 Somali migrants who had come to the United States via Cairo and via Nairobi and other places. And one of them, his name was Hussein, he and I became very close. We were coworkers. We worked on employment support. He opened a local grocery store, essentially, in a community, but then now spends half of his year back in Somalia helping rebuild the government. And for local Mainers, it's hard to get their head around. Like he's a small shop owner here, and he's a political leader in a country. So I think those are stories that are amazing. And how does it feel for him to navigate those worlds?
Yes, that's so true. And when I was thinking about your story yesterday, I was also thinking that in Somalia, he's also meeting people, Somalis from Canada, Somalis from Norway, Somalis from other parts of the world who are all converging. So,
right.
And they're living in places, but they're also living together in this sort of connected world,
right.
that also is connected with Somalia. So
right.
sort of, I mean, we call that diaspora,
right.
But I think maybe sometimes it would be really so interesting to understand a bit more about what those interconnected stories on the move actually sound like.
Yeah.
I know that from the work that I did with folks from Sudan, this is northern Sudan, they're pretty mobile. You know, people will go and visit a relative for 3 months or 6 months, and then they'll go back somewhere else. Maybe mothers will go to their daughter's house in England, and then maybe they'll go to their son's house in Abu Dhabi for a while, and they're sort of connected with each other. But again, when we think about refugee and forced migration stories, we don't necessarily think of those. These people left Sudan maybe in the early 90s, and they're still connected with Sudan, but they're also connected with each other in these different kind of places.
It's so funny. So your specialty, or one of your focuses, is the Sudanese diaspora, correct?
Yes.
But I've also had a long history of welcoming and working with Sudanese refugees in this country. And one of my favorite stories, I don't have time to tell right now, but we'll never forget, is when the Saints won the Super Bowl. There was a national conference where all the Sudanese who had been resettled as lost boys had gathered. And this happens once a year, and it is quite an event, because you're imagining all these young men and women who have been displaced around the country coming back together, who had spent 5 to 7 years together. But it was the day of the Super Bowl. And we were at a conference and I was doing a training on capacity building and integration with these Sudanese leaders. And they were not as involved in football, but the cheering started outside. And next thing we know, we're all on the streets celebrating the win of the Saints.
Nice.
And I'm trying to teach football, which as a non-football fan was in itself ridiculous, the worst cultural orientation ever. But it's moments like those, those are moments I stand and look like, this is an amazing world of all these connections. But I have to ask, Anita, I will own that I'm pretty much a settled person. I spent my entire life in Maine. I now live in New England. And I have had the privilege of traveling and working abroad and spending some time. But I think most people would see me and identify more as rooted. You have lived in lots of places. What's your identity?
I have. I've been thinking about this because my colleague Katrine Brun and I are working on a book about homemaking for people living with displacement. And we thought that we'd better take a look at our own assumptions and biases as kind of, yes, it's true. I've lived in a lot of different places as well, but I'm also, I have a kind of settled background if you really want to come down to it. But what I really think is happening for me is an understanding that as much as I'm settled, I've also lived in different places. So have lots of Americans. We're a very mobile bunch. And, I think that I'm really curious to see how settled people can recognize some of the mobility in their lives and therefore understand a little bit better what it's like to be a person from a forced migration background or a refugee background. And maybe, I know you asked me to think about the lessons from COVID-19, so I'll just jump right in there.
I was going to say, nice transition.
Yeah, I was really thinking about this a lot as a teacher at Clark University. Like all of the other universities in the US, Clark sent its students home to shelter somewhere else. So not at Clark, right? Because the campus had to shut down. It was so worrisome. Just, you know, the kind of activities that we do are high COVID transmission type things, like talking a lot and being in a small room. But one of the things that I was learning from my students who were obliged to go home was that they thought that that was really complicated, that maybe the place that they were going home didn't feel very homey anymore. They had been at Clark for a long time. Maybe they were seniors and they felt a different kind of community emerging from their friends that they were sort of building out as, you know, adults. And so there was that story, people feeling a little bit alienated in their original home. And I thought, oh, that can help us link with how people feel in various integration scenarios, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then there were other folks that I heard about at Clark who might not have even felt comfortable returning to their natal home. And they were obliged to stay back in Worcester. Worcester, Massachusetts is the city where Clark is based. And I thought that was pretty profound too. The feelings that were expressed to me were almost like feelings of exile, not being able to return to a family through any number of reasons, right? People might have transitioned to a different gender identity and not wanting to share that with their families and various things like that. So it's really, I thought it was really so useful to bring these stories out and show my students. And I had taught a class called Cultures of Exile online. And we did a lot of talking about how we could understand better, maybe, or at least find some resonance around the idea of exile from our own experiences, having to go to places that were no longer welcoming or were never welcoming or didn't welcome us in, in our current situations. So I thought, I think there's a lot of intersection between what's been going on now and with the lessons and tools that forced migration studies can give us.
Right. We actually, one of our storytellers who performed 2 years ago he was gay and being persecuted because of it in his home country. He fled to Egypt, actually Cairo, persecuted again, and eventually got here and was able to find safety. But he would be the first to say he couldn't go home under any circumstance without living a hidden life. And I was just noticing that he just recently moved, I believe, to the Midwest. And I thought within 2 years, he's already moved again here in the United States and he's finding his own way. I also have been reflecting too about, it's not a direct correlation, COVID-19 and being a forced migrant from refugees, but there are so many similarities in some of the emotional experiences. And we also have had clients this week and also some suitcase storytellers in the last month who have lost loved ones in their their countries they originated from,
yes,
and are not able to be there with them right now.
Yes.
And I just again, these are not the things that should have to connect us, but it's at least, I think, going to change the dialogue and open these conversations, which
right.
You and I know this is what Anita and I really connect over, which is this question and desire to create commonalities and moments of intersection that are not based on your race or your religion necessarily, but your common experiences. So she and I started a project a few years ago called Shared Worlds, and we interviewed over 100 residents in Worcester, US and foreign born. And we asked, at the time, was the city welcoming? But what we were even more interested in is beyond just, is it welcoming, is do you have meaningful relationships with people outside of your insular community? And what we heard, and I'm going to summarize because we don't have tons of time, or at least my takeaway, and Anita, you could disagree, was that most people found the city welcoming, which is generally often a case in many areas, but they didn't have connections, both the US and the foreign born. They had a desire, but they really didn't know how to make those connections. And when I had the opportunity to teach at Clark with students there, one of the questions I always started my class with, which really offended students, and it was sort of intentional, right? I want to wake them up, was, can you manufacture relationships between US and foreign born? And the word manufacturer sounds like completely contrary to the goal of good relationship building. But my point was, otherwise we take this sit back and assume it's going to happen. And somewhere between those two truths has to be some catalyst or at least some event. And in this case, it might be COVID-19. We're seeing a lot of relationships building, but also just exploring. And we didn't get to all the what could work, would work, but it's something I know you and I share. And you were telling me a story about your work overseas and in Greece, and an example where circumstances brought you at the time, well, Greek people and migrants together in an unexpected way. Would you mind sharing that story?
Yeah, sure. This was a story that I actually heard secondhand, but it really impressed me as a as a sort of organic, but also the intention was there to create that organic thing happening. And the organization that I had the extreme pleasure to work with, or I was just sort of shadowing, was an organization. I think it's got the Melissa Network. It's the Melissa Network in Athens. And what was amazing about this network is that it started off 10 years before the most recent challenging times of many forced migrants coming through Europe. That was 2015. So it started 10 years before that. And it was made up of networks of women workers who came to Greece as migrant workers and who created this network to help each other figure out how to learn Greek, where to put their kids in school, you know, the sort of, but it was migrants helping migrants with some support, really meaningful support from Greek colleagues and helpers. But the story that was told to me by the director was that in this new era of tension around many more people coming through Greece from refugee backgrounds, wanting to go through Greece or move through Europe to get to where their family was living, there was a lot of tension in the neighborhoods. And there were, you might have remembered, the Golden Dawn, which was a fascist organization. They were doing some demonstrations against migrants and refugees. But what had happened with this Melissa Network approach, it was sort of organic in the sense that they had some donations of money that they wanted to distribute to the newcomer refugees. And they didn't even have a bank account. That's how sort of sudden it was. So instead, they asked the local stores, hey, would you take this money and give us, you know, spaghetti and rice on credit? Or, hey, hairdresser, would you take this money and when our clients need haircuts, you know, you can draw down that funding. So it was sort of a win-win, you know, and the storekeepers got to know the refugees and the organization. And over time, they became a sort of like a little bit of a guardian circle around the organization. And they were able to help give them notice if there was a scary demonstration coming with the kind of far right fascist guys. Sorry, I don't know very much about the politics of Greece, and other people may be able to correct me. But what I think I take away as an integration, somebody interested in integration, was that they really were able to find these organic connections with neighbors on the basis of shopkeeping. I mean, everybody needs to buy stuff. Everybody needs to get their hair cut. And those kinds of connections create that, you know, that web of connections or relationships that you were talking about. But I think they can be shaped through those kinds of intentional ways. So, yes, is it what's the word you used, Cheryl?
Manufactured.
Manufactured. Yeah, is it manufactured? It could be, but we could learn from that and maybe manufacture some ways to create some kind of maybe financial bonds at first, but different kinds of connections that then grow into something different.
Well, and when I asked the question to your students, they had to come up with a project that would at least move the needle in terms of having people at least be in presence with each other, right?
Hmm.
One of the stories I often tell also is that the Habitat for Humanity was back in Maine was building several homes, and one of them was going to go to a Somali family, and there was some pushback on that, feeling like they shouldn't have been given it first. Even though it wasn't first, they were on the same application list. So
Right.
what they did, rather than have each house built separately, they built them simultaneously, and they had to help each other work on each other's homes. Well, suddenly you're there holding a hammer, right? And you're building each of your futures together. And that actually, again, was a way to get people talking. They were doing something together and physically in each other's presence in a way that they wouldn't have otherwise. And what came out of that was some meaningful friendships. So, manufactured, like to scare people with the word, but I think the intent is just to explore, what does this look like? And for Suitcase Stories, for us, it's this. It's the exchanging of stories to see our lives in each other, or see what we don't know about each other's lives, to build empathy. And in the last minutes, I gotta turn to storytelling. You usually help people tell stories, or you collect people's stories. I asked you to tell a story. How was that experience, Anita?
Scariest moment of my life. Absolutely terrifying, but it was also an amazing experience to be able to share and, for myself, connect the dots with some of the stories that I had heard from my father. And I in that story, I told a little bit about what it was like to be the child of a refugee who was involved in trying to smuggle money out of Hungary that his parents had collected and invested in the United States so that he could send it back so that they can help build a house, which is what they did back in Hungary. And the story was interesting because I had no idea what was going on. I was 12 and they left me, my parents left me in the middle of a busy street in Vienna with my brother and sister and all of our suitcases. And, I had no idea what was going on. But reflecting on it over the years, I realized that, my father was sort of keeping his network of relationships with his family and his country alive, even though he had no intention of ever living in Hungary again. It was so important for him to keep um, either if they were financial, they weren't just financial. They had other meanings that connected him with what he had lost in his life as a refugee and what he had found again as a property owner in the United States. So
And
it was a very helpful experience, actually.
doesn't it end with him having a similar, is it acreage or similar? There was a twist at the end that he had actually.
That's right. He was buying the same number of acres that his family farm in Hungary that had been lost to the government. And then he stopped buying land. It was really interesting. It wasn't that he was buying it to become a big landowner. It was
Yeah.
definitely linked to that experience of loss and then
That was
regaining
the part
what
that
he
took my
lost.
breath away. And I've known you 10 years, and until you said that on stage, and you said you had sort of only recently figured that out. It was this discovery into yourself and your family. And so I
Yeah.
was just like, that is the type of stories that need to be shared, just unequivocally. And it is always funny to me, though, when professors who do a lot of speaking suddenly find this terrifying, but it's yourself.
No
Right?
notes, Cheryl. No notes.
No notes. That's true. That's the
It's
problem.
really hard.
Well, listen, Anita, I could obviously talk to you forever. For people listening, you can find Anita Fabos at Clark University's website. You can also learn more about Witness at the Witness website. And you can learn more about Suitcase Stories at our website at suitcasestories.org. But Anita, thank you for giving us your time. And we just appreciate everything you do out there to educate and create a better
Thank you
world.
so much, Cheryl. Thanks. It's always
You're
great
welcome.
to see you and talk to you.